Hello everyone, and welcome back to Boss Economic World, where we peel back the bland corporate speak to find the juicy, often ridiculous, truth at the heart of the global economy. Today, we're jetting off to beautiful Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. The official story? The US and China are having very constructive discussions. Constructive. You know, that's the same word you use when your kid builds a Lego tower that immediately collapses. It's what you say when your friend asks for feedback on their terrible screenplay. In diplomacy, constructive is code for we spent 5.5 hours in a room together and nobody threw a chair. But what are they really talking about inside the world's second tallest building? Is this a genuine attempt to mend fences between the world's two biggest economies? Or is it just the world's most expensive, highest stakes episode of a reality TV show? Spoiler alert, it's mostly the latter. But the script for this show has devastating real-world consequences. So grab your coffee, buckle up, and let's unravel the full picture. So, the scene is set. We have U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and Chinese Vice Premier He Lifeng locked in a room. Think of them as the head coaches, trying to execute plays drawn up by the team owners, President Trump and President Xi, who are scheduled to meet next week at the APEC summit in South Korea. This isn't their first rodeo. This is the sequel to the 2018 to 2020 trade war, and like most Hollywood sequels, the explosions are bigger, the plot is more convoluted, and the logic is questionable. Let's start with the headline number, the one that makes any sane economist's eye twitch. President Trump, on his way to Asia, casually mentions, we're at 157% tariff for them. Let's be crystal clear. A 157% tariff is not a trade tool. It's a declaration of economic war. It's not a negotiation tactic, it's a brick wall with "Go away" spray painted on it. To put this in perspective, the average US tariff on goods from countries it has normal trade relations with is about 2%. Your average Smoot-Hawley tariff back in the 1930s, the ones that helped cannonball the world into the Great Depression, topped out around 60%. Trump is playing on a whole other level. He's not trying to make Chinese goods a little more expensive. He's trying to make them commercially extinct in the US market. When he says he doesn't think that's sustainable for them, it's the understatement of the century. It's like saying jumping out of a plane without a parachute isn't sustainable for your health. So why this astronomical number? It's classic Trump. You start with an absolutely insane position so that when you offer to compromise by, say, lowering it to 90%, you look like the reasonable one. It's the art of the manufactured deal. But behind the bluster, what does each side actually want from this five-star hotel showdown? The official statements are a smokescreen. Let's look at the shopping list. According to the White House press pool, Trump is willing to extend the truce, which, by the way, expires on November 10th, adding a nice little ticking clock to the drama in exchange for three things from China. First, soybeans. Why is the President of the United States so obsessed with soybeans? It's simple, votes. The American Farm Belt was ground zero for China's retaliation in the first trade war. In 2017, before the fireworks started, the US sold about $14 billion worth of soybeans to China. By 2018, that had plummeted to just over $3 billion. That's a 75% drop. Farmers were drowning in beans they couldn't sell. Trump needs to go back to Iowa, Ohio, and Nebraska in the run-up to the 2026 midterms and say, see? I fought for you, and now the Chinese are buying our crops again. It's a potent, simple, and visually effective political victory. For Xi, agreeing to buy a few $1 billion of soybeans is a cheap concession. It's like paying your annoying neighbor $20 to stop mowing his lawn at 6 a.m. It's worth the price for a little peace and quiet. Second on the list, fentanyl. This is the darkest part of the negotiation. The US is in the grips of a devastating opioid crisis, with fentanyl being the primary killer. The US argument is that Chinese chemical companies are the main source of the precursor chemicals used to make illicit fentanyl, which then flows into the US, primarily via Mexico. For Trump, this is an incredibly powerful issue. It blends national security, public health, and a tough-on-China stance. Cracking down on fentanyl is a political grand slam. China's official position has been that the US needs to solve its own demand problem, but they also know this is a red line for Washington. Expect to see China make some high-profile arrests and announce new regulations on chemical exports. It's another relatively low-cost concession that gives Trump a massive political win he can trumpet back home. And third, the big one, rare earths. This is where it gets really interesting. This is China's ace in the hole. If the US-China trade war is a high-stakes poker game, rare earths are China's royal flush. What are rare earths? They're a group of 17 elements that are, despite the name, not all that rare. But they are incredibly difficult and dirty to mine and process. And China has spent the last 40 years cornering the market. As of 2025, China still controls over 60% of the world's mining of rare earths, but more critically, it controls nearly 90% of the processing. The US has a mine, Mountain Pass in California, but for years it had to ship its concentrated ore to China for processing. Think about that. The world's most advanced military and tech economy was dependent on its primary strategic rival for the vitamins of modern technology. Everything from your iPhone screen to the guidance systems in a Tomahawk missile to the magnets in an F-35 fighter jet and the engine of a Tesla Model 3 relies on these elements. When Beijing vowed to broaden controls on rare earth exports, it was a shot across the bow. It was China saying, "You think your tech restrictions hurt? We can turn off the lights on your entire high-tech economy." This is why Trump is demanding they back off. He knows this is a genuine vulnerability. So, the deal on the table looks simple: you buy our beans and stop the drug chemicals, and we'll buy your gadgets. You stop threatening to cut off our magic rocks, and maybe, just maybe, we'll talk about that 157% tariff. Sounds like a straightforward trade, right? Wrong. Because this negotiation isn't about soybeans or even rare earths. That's the surface-level drama. The real conflict, the one they aren't discussing in the official readouts, is much deeper and more intractable. The truth is, the trade war of 2018 is over. We are now in the opening salvos of the tech Cold War. What you're seeing in Kuala Lumpur is just a sideshow to that main event. What does the US really want? It's no longer about the trade deficit. That's a 2016 talking point. The core US strategy, under both Democrats and Republicans, is now what's called the small yard, high fence approach. The yard is a small, specific set of foundational technologies: advanced semiconductors, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and biotechnology. The fence is a series of ever-tightening export controls, investment blacklists, and sanctions designed to prevent China from ever reaching the top in these fields. Washington's latest move, broadening tech restrictions and proposing levies on Chinese ships, is part of this fence building. The goal isn't to win a trade dispute, it's to permanently kneecap China's technological ascent. The fear in the Pentagon and on Capitol Hill is not that China will make more t-shirts than the US. The fear is that the next generation of military and economic power will be determined by AI and quantum computing, and they are terrified of a world where Beijing, not Washington, holds the keys to that kingdom. The 157% tariff is a blunt instrument in this strategy. It's designed to accelerate decoupling, forcing US companies to move their supply chains out of China, starving China of the dollars, investment, and knowledge transfer that have fueled its growth for 30 years. What does China really want? Survival. And self-sufficiency. President Xi has seen the writing on the wall. He knows that the US is determined to contain China's rise. His answer is a strategy called dual circulation. It's a fancy term for a simple idea: rely more on China's massive domestic market while still trading with the world where possible. But the most critical piece of this is achieving technological independence. Beijing is pouring hundreds of billions of dollars, a state-led effort dwarfing the US CHIPS Act, into building its own semiconductor industry from scratch. It's a monumental task. They are trying to replicate an entire global ecosystem, from design software to advanced lithography machines, inside their own borders. Their moves on rare earths and other critical materials like graphite are a defensive response. It's China signaling, if you are going to try and choke our tech industry, we will show you that we have a hand on your windpipe, too. It's strategic deterrence. So, you have two superpowers with fundamentally opposing, near-existential goals. The US wants to stop China's tech rise. China believes its tech rise is essential for its national destiny and security. Can you solve that with a soybean purchase? Absolutely not. This is where the story gets bigger than just Trump and Xi. The rest of the world is not just a passive audience, they are on the playing field, and they are getting trampled. Why are they meeting in Malaysia? It's not just for the great food. It's symbolic. Southeast Asia has become the new frontline of this economic conflict. As US tariffs on China soared, trade patterns did something fascinating. This is called transshipment. Chinese parts are sent to these countries, undergo some minor assembly, maybe a final screw is put in, and a made in Vietnam sticker is slapped on, and then they're shipped to the US, bypassing the massive tariffs. It's the global supply chain equivalent of using a fake ID. This is putting countries like Malaysia in an incredibly awkward position. On one hand, they're getting a flood of new investment and factory orders. On the other hand, they are becoming laundering hubs for Chinese goods, which invites the wrath of the US. And their own local manufacturers are getting crushed by the sheer volume of Chinese competition. You heard the Malaysian foreign minister: we cross our fingers that the US and China come to their senses. That's the polite diplomatic way of saying, when two elephants fight, the grass gets trampled. And right now, we are the grass. This trade war is injecting a massive dose of uncertainty and inefficiency into the global economy. Companies don't know where to build their next factory. Do you stay in China and risk 157% tariffs? Do you move to Vietnam and risk getting caught in the transshipment crossfire? Do you reshore back to the US, where labor is 10 times more expensive? This uncertainty is a tax on everyone. It fuels inflation, kills investment, and slows down global growth. The IMF has been warning about this fragmentation for years, and now in late 2025, we are seeing its effects in real time. So, what will happen in Kuala Lumpur and Seoul? Will Besant and Ha Lefeng pull a rabbit out of the hat? Will Trump and Xi emerge from their meeting with a grand bargain that solves everything? Of course not. The fundamental conflict is unsolvable at this stage. Here's the most likely outcome: they will strike a deal. But it will be a shallow, temporary, face-saving deal. A truce of the soybeans. China will agree to make some massive, very public purchases of American soybeans and pork. They will announce a special task force to crack down on fentanyl precursors. They will quietly pause any new threats about rare earth exports. In return, Trump will get to hold a massive press conference. He'll declare victory, saying he brought China to the table. He will agree to pause the next round of tariff hikes and perhaps walk back the levy on Chinese ships. The 157% figure will remain as a threat, a gun held to China's head, but he won't pull the trigger, for now. The November 10th deadline will be extended. The stock markets will rally for a few days. Everyone will breathe a sigh of relief. But nothing will have fundamentally changed. The US will continue building its high fence around technology. China will continue its frantic, all-out push for self-sufficiency. The supply chains will continue to shift. The global economy will continue to fracture. This isn't a peace treaty. It's a ceasefire. It's two boxers going back to their corners to catch their breath before the next round. The real fight isn't in the negotiation room, it's in the semiconductor fabs of Taiwan, the AI research labs of Silicon Valley and Shenzhen, and the boardrooms of global companies forced to choose a side. So as you watch the news next week, don't get mesmerized by the handshake photos and the talk of tremendous progress. Look past the performance. The real story is the silent, tectonic shift happening underneath a world economy splitting in two. That's the world of economics for you. A grand meeting in the sky, a multi-trillion-dollar argument, and it all boils down to who controls the beans and who controls the chips. This time, they'll trade some beans for a temporary truce. But the fight over the chips has only just begun. This is Boss Economic World, giving you the full picture. We'll see you next time.